As the Second World War progressed, the Germans found themselves recruiting further and further afield. In the previous video in this series, I covered the thousands of Muslim volunteers from the Soviet Union in the East. The Bosnians, however, are far better known. Most will have seen one or two of the more famous images of the Bosnians wearing their fezzes. Few, however, know what the Bosnian SS actually did or whether they were effective at all. This, then, is the complete history of the Bosnian SS. A couple of things before we begin. First of all, a quick disclaimer. This video is purely a work of history and is in no way, shape, or form political. Please do not overthink it and turn it into something it is not. Thank you. Secondly, a gigantic thank you to those of you who have signed up to my Subscribe Star or as YouTube members since my Patreon was randomly banned. That was a huge hit for the channel, and I've only been able to carry on due to your kind support, and I simply cannot thank you enough. For those of you who were previously signed up on Patreon or considering becoming a member, please do consider doing so. It goes a long way. Even the lowest tier helps immensely. Thank you. Despite promises to the contrary, the Muslims of the newly independent Croatian state were not having a good time. Mile Budak, the Minister for Culture and Education, proclaimed, quote, "The Croatian state is Christian. It is also a Muslim state, where our people are of the Mohammedan religion," end quote. In reality, however, only 2 of the 20 state ministers and 13 of the 206 people's representatives were Muslim. On the ground, the nation had descended into anarchy and had completely split along religious lines, as each side tried to slaughter the other. The Ustasha, obviously, were in the best position, and even the Germans were surprised at the scale of the slaughter they inflicted upon the Muslims of the Balkans. Things had slowed down in late 1941, but the tit-for-tat killings just picked right back up again in the new year, throughout the summer and autumn. The Germans felt that only they could keep order in Croatia, but with so many men tied up in Stalingrad, it would obviously be a ridiculous idea to bother with a sideshow like Croatia. With this in mind, Himmler proposed the idea of creating a Bosnian division to fight partisans on their own turf. The Bosnians, Himmler said, were not actually Slavs, but rather the descendants of Aryan Gothic invaders. Hitler approved of the idea, and Himmler sent off SS Obersturmbannführer Lech to meet the local German envoy in Croatia. The Islamic religion itself was actually part of the draw for Himmler. He once remarked to Goebbels, quote, "I have nothing against Islam, because it educates the men in this division for me and promises them heaven if they fight, and are killed in action. That's a highly practical and attractive religion for soldiers," end quote. From his prior experience in the East, Himmler knew how important the spiritual well-being of his men was. With this in mind, 2 SS schools were set up to train imams, one at Dresden and one at Göttingen. This was not all. Himmler also enlisted the help of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. In early 1943, al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti, gave a speech regarding the Muslims of Bosnia. Quote, "The hearts of all Muslims must today go out to our Islamic brothers in Bosnia, who are forced to endure a tragic fate. They are being persecuted by the Serbian and communist bandits. They are being murdered, their possessions are robbed, and their villages are burned. England and its allies bear a great accountability before history for mishandling and murdering Europe's Muslims, just as they have done in the Arabic lands and in India," end quote. This was mere days before the planned conference to launch the new division. The Croats were obviously less than happy about the whole ordeal, and perhaps quite rightly viewed the situation as a threat to their own flimsy sovereignty. A nation with flimsy sovereignty, however, is in no position to make demands. The unit's creation went ahead. SS Obergruppenführer Arthur Martin Phleps was the man who Himmler and Gottlob Berger, the father of the foreign SS, chose for the job. The man himself didn't view himself as fit for the job, but regardless, he was won over and came to an agreement with the Croats, which allowed his recruiting efforts to begin on the 20th of March, 1943. Phleps' recruits swept across Bosnia with a clear message. The glorious tradition of the old Austro-Hungarian Bosnian regiments was being reborn, they said. On top of this, the new unit would bring security for the Muslim communities, who were beset on all sides by the Chetniks, partisans, and Ustasha. Within less than a month, 8,000 men had volunteered. Perhaps the biggest recruiting tool of all was the state of civil war within the country. Every time the Ustasha, partisans, or Chetniks targeted the Muslim community, a flood of young Muslims would sign up for what they believed was the best defense they could get: German uniforms, German training, and German weapons. True to his word, the Grand Mufti turned up on the scene too and toured Bosnia from the 30th of March until the 14th of April. He met with local Muslim leaders and spoke in mosques, exhorting his audience to take advantage of the German offer and join the division. The recruits were sent towards Waldflecken, northeast of Frankfurt am Main. Already, a new commander was brought in the form of SS Standartenführer Herbert von Abwehrser, an imposing Austrian who was considered a good fit to answer the cultural sensitivities of the Bosnians. Initially, the division started out with the name Croatian SS Volunteer Division. This was due to the Croatians not wanting any overt references to a separate Bosnian Muslim identity. A series of other names were used until eventually, in May 1944, the name 13th SS Mountain Division Handschar was settled on. The name is a strange one, but a Handschar is the Arabic word for a type of long dagger. Gottlob Berger himself was the one who suggested the name. Due to inadequate facilities in the Balkans, a request was made to Berlin for the unit to be moved elsewhere. On the 6th of June, headquarters in Berlin responded and said that the SS Handschar was to form up in occupied France. The logic was fairly simple. In France, there was much better facilities, and the recruits could be trained unmolested by the growing partisan menace. The recruits did not see things this way. They had signed up to protect their families and homes, and now they were being whisked off to France. In their mind, they were abandoning their loved ones during a time of desperate need. Whenever news came of an attack on a Muslim village back in Bosnia, morale, quite understandably, took a huge dip. Regardless, the location chosen was the departments of south-central France, and from the 1st of July, transports of volunteers began to arrive from their staging points further east. A new commander had now since taken charge too, in the form of Colonel Carl Gustav Sauberweg, who had been brought over from the army. Sauberweg was a strange fit. He was not a member of the Nazi Party, did not speak Serbo-Croat, had not served in a mountain formation before, nor had he served in the Balkans, or with foreign volunteers of any kind. More importantly, he had never commanded a division before. He did, however, have an Iron Cross second and first class to his name from the Great War and had proven himself in the current war. He immediately made quite the impression, and soon enough he was roaring around the French countryside in his staff car, injecting pace and belief into the division. He formed a real bond with the officers and men, and veterans would still end up looking back fondly decades later. The worried men were reassured that soon enough they would be ready and sent back home to do their job and defend their families. There were problems with the division right off the bat, however. There was a struggle to fill its command cadres of officers and NCOs, and the division had to resort to compulsion or the call-up of reservists to fill the ranks. On top of this, 4 entire infantry battalions were essentially just skeletons or were struck off the establishment. In terms of equipment, things also looked bleak. The Handschar was essentially getting bottom-shelf equipment, that being captured Czech, French, and Russian weaponry. Very few modern German arms were given. These problems were about to seem negligible. From the very beginning, the SS and Croat authorities had been concerned about the division being infiltrated by Tito's partisans, who could then receive excellent training and equipment. From there, they could cause all kinds of chaos and potentially recruit even more partisans, who would, in this case, have received the best training regime in the entire world. The move to southern France was partly undertaken to prevent all of this. Strict observance of Islamic customs in regards to food, alcohol, and religion had also been upheld in order to prevent infiltration. 4 men had separately joined the unit, but quickly discovered that they were all on the same page. 2 of these men were Muslims, the other 2 Catholic. Bozo Jelinek and Nikola Vukalic, the Catholics, were both highly intelligent and motivated, and Jelinek had already been promoted to officer cadet rank. Vukalic was thought up as a potential company commander. Jelinek was a member of the Yugoslav Communist Party and had joined the party under an alias after his release from a prison term for his politics. Vukalic had no overt political views, but had become fiercely anti-German. The 2 Muslims were Lutfidja Dizdarovic and Ferid Dazanik. Dazanik was to become the ringleader of this little group. He had previously served in the Yugoslav army during the German invasion, but escaped imprisonment and joined the partisans in 1942. He was then captured by the Germans, but amazingly allowed to volunteer for the Handschar. All 4 of these fellows were in the same subunit, the 13th Pioneer Battalion, based in the town of Villefranche de Rouergue. The 4 of them got together and then made contact with the local resistance through sympathetic staff at the hotel which housed the battalion's officers. The 4 leaders then concocted a plan in which the German commanders would be seized and executed. They would then lead the battalion onto Rodza, 30 miles to the west. Here, they would raise the local regiment in revolt and go from garrison to garrison until the region was on fire. The plan from there was extremely vague and naive. They couldn't decide whether to head for the south coast and escape to Allied North Africa, or whether to make a dash for the Alps and then go back into Croatia overland. The long-term plan may have been lackluster, but the mutiny itself was not. On the night of the 16th to 17th of September, all hell broke loose shortly after midnight. The guards arrested the German NCOs and the two pioneer training companies before seizing key points across the town, including the battalion headquarters. Vukovic and Dejanek then led their troops to the Hotel Hodern, where the sleeping officers were awoken and then bundled into room 4, where they were kept under guard. The majority of them were then shot dead. Only 2 officers survived. SS Obersturmbannführer Alexander Mickiewicz punched his guards and made a run for it. Dr. Willifried Schwieger was meanwhile told that he would be spared so that he could minister to the mutineers. The battalion imam, Halim Malkok, then appeared on the scene and announced that he had known nothing of the mutiny. He spoke to the men of the first company and urged them not to join the revolt, and then went off to release the German NCOs. Together, they took back the town. The 2 Muslim leaders, Dizdarovic and Dejanek, were killed in the fighting, and Vukovic, the Catholic, was captured. Jelinek fled as soon as it became clear that the mutiny was finished. He went on to join the French resistance and served with distinction before returning to Yugoslavia in late 1944. With the leaders out of action, the mutiny lost steam, and the Bosnians were disarmed and placed under guard. By mid-morning of the 17th, it was all over. SS justice was swift. On the morning of the 18th, proceedings began. By the afternoon, 14 Bosnians, including Vukovic, were found guilty of mutiny and sentenced to death. The entire pioneer battalion was paraded to watch the sentences being carried out in a field opposite the town cemetery. The men were led to a stake in the field, tied down, and then shot by firing squad. Over the next few days, 4 other Bosnians deserted, but were hunted down, brought back, and shot. It was decided that the unit needed a purge to ensure its loyalty. The Handschar was then moved to Silesia, where 825 Bosnians were culled from the ranks and sent to Dachau. From there, many were pressured into joining the Todd organization as laborers, whilst the rest were sent along to Neuengamme concentration camp. The worst consequence of the mutiny was actually Hitler's reaction. He demanded that all Osttruppen be dissolved. This was obviously impossible, as the Eastern Front had hundreds of thousands of them in their ranks as Hiwis. A compromise was reached, in which the Germans in the west would swap with the Russians and Asiatics in the east. By the beginning of June 1944, 1 in 6 battalions defending the Atlantic Wall was composed of Osttruppen. Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben's 709th Infantry Division was based in Cherbourg and now saw 1 in 5 of its ranks filled by Hiwis. He remarked, quote, "We are asking rather a lot if we expect Russians to fight in France for Germany against Americans," end quote. He was quite right. In the East, they were fighting for the future of their countries, and they understood their surroundings. In the West, they could obviously not be expected to fight a strange enemy for strange reasons. When D-Day came, they quite predictably melted like butter. Walter Cohn, a regimental commander in northern France, said, quote, "They fell to pieces immediately. They held out for a while, but when things became critical, they took to their heels too," end quote. By the 1st of October, the Handschar was moving by rail to its new home in the northeast. Despite a recent recruitment drive, which had brought in another 1,000 Bosnians, the unit was still struggling to fill its establishment. Some of the smaller units had to be removed, so others could be brought up to strength. A new draft of German officers and NCOs was also brought in, which gave some life to the division, and they were able to stitch things back together after the disaster in France. Within a few months, the unit was actually looking nearly combat ready, and the festivities of Bayram to celebrate the end of Ramadan were greeted with much jubilation. The divisional imam, Abdullah Muhasilovic, addressed his men, quote, "As we observe this Bayram feast with good food and even havla, an entire army of our brothers, our refugees, wander about from city to village, wrapped in rags, barefooted, hungry, and cold. Their Bayram feast will be spent in misery and distress. It is even sadder that Chetniks and partisans carry on their activities, murdering and plundering wherever they go. But we call out to them, you can murder and plunder, but the day will come when the tables are turned. And to you, dear and beloved Bosnia, we appeal to you, our beloved parents, wives, and children. Be patient and ask our God that we finish our training quickly. We will then return and thrash our enemies with the courage of lions and liberate our cities and villages, our Bosnia," end quote. They wouldn't have to wait long. On the 21st of November, Himmler visited the division and was thoroughly impressed, as was the Grand Mufti. By the beginning of December, the division's strength was 21,065 men. There was still the old problem of a lack of officers and NCOs, however. Regardless, it was almost time to go, and the men had gotten about as much training as they needed. Meanwhile, back home in Croatia, the country was in a state of anarchy. The government could barely feed its citizens, let alone tackle Tito's partisans. The Italians had now since switched sides, and the situation became even more complex. Thousands of relieved Italian soldiers simply tossed down their weapons and headed for the Adriatic coast in order to get home. The partisans simply swept into the void and emptied the arsenals. Some Italians were even pressed into teaching the partisans how to use their newfound heavy weapons, including artillery, mortars, heavy machine guns, and even light tanks and armored cars. Meanwhile, almost a year to the day since their formation, the Handschar began arriving back in Bosnia in February 1944. On entering Croatia, the train slowed down and inched carefully forwards as the crew kept watch for mines. When the train did finally stop, the unit immediately got into a defensive formation in case of attack. This was nothing like France with its wide open spaces. In Bosnia, the unit would have to stick together to survive against the partisan horde. The Handschar's mission was to be the destruction of the partisans in northeastern Bosnia between the Sava, Bosna, Spreka, and Drina rivers, secure agricultural production, and safeguard the Volksdeutsch enclave around Srem to the north. Their first task was to clear the Borsut forest, a marshy and heavily wooded area a few miles south of Sid, which had been in partisan hands for a long time. On the 10th of March, at 4 a.m., the SS Handschar went into action for the first time. Supported by heavy artillery, they pushed forwards and took town after town. The partisans quickly realized that they were outmatched and looked for an escape route. Using local boats, the majority of them crossed the Sava River and disappeared into the woods. Within 3 days, it was over. 573 partisans had been killed and 82 had been captured, but up to 2,000 had escaped. Despite the operation's limited success, the Handschar had performed well. With Borsut Forest temporarily cleared, it was time to cross the river and head to the division's main recruiting area. The unit, then, would be fighting for their very homes. With the Italian betrayal and the Croatians in disarray, the area had now since been overrun by Tito's forces. This was exactly what the men of the Handschar had signed up and trained for. Before their crossing, Sauberweg wrote an open letter to his men. Quote, "We have now reached the Bosnian frontier and will begin the march into the homeland. I was recently able to travel through almost all of Bosnia. What I saw shocked me. The fields lay uncultivated, the villages burned out and destroyed. The few remaining inhabitants live in cellars or underground shelters. Misery reigns in the refugee camps as I've never seen before in my life. This must be changed through swift and energetic action. Before long, each of you shall be standing in the place that you call home, as a soldier and a gentleman, standing firm as a defender of the idea of saving the culture of Europe, the idea of Adolf Hitler. I wish every one of you soldiers luck, and know that you will be loyal until the end." End quote. On the 15th of March, Operation Sava was launched, and a huge artillery barrage was fired at the dug-in partisans so the Bosnians could cross the river. At some crossing points, resistance was light, and the Bosnians took the nearby towns with ease. At others, however, the Bosnians were fighting from the moment they crossed, and were pinned down in heavy fighting. Regardless, they were up to the task, and the communist counterattack on the 17th was repulsed with heavy losses. 201 partisans lay dead in the field. Further counterattacks were launched, and all were failures. One partisan commander wrote, quote, "On the 19th of March, we were ordered to take Zabrud. The enemy had dug in, and we were unable to dislodge them. We fought until noon, when our ammunition was exhausted. The enemy pressed the attack, but we had to escape. We had heavy losses. In these 4 days, the brigade suffered 50 dead, 82 wounded, and 40 missing." End quote. By the 20th, the partisans had retreated south, leaving their dead behind. The Bosnians wanted to keep on pushing, but it was time to consolidate. Regardless, Operation Sava had been a great success. Jonathan Trigg writes of the division at this time in his book, Hitler's Jihadis, quote, "Overall, the SS Handschar had performed well. Many accounts of the Muslim SS Handschar state plainly that the formation had no redeeming military qualities, never did anything other than commit atrocities, and definitely didn't carry out successful operations in the face of stiff opposition. Signpost and Sava proved this is a modern myth. True, the Bosnians were not up against the might of the Red Army, but they had not been trained or equipped for that theatre. They were an out-and-out anti-partisan division, conceived to fight Tito, and the month of March 1944 was their baptism of fire. In that time, they had cleared the notorious partisan stronghold in Borsut, made an opposed river crossing of the Sava south back into Bosnia, and then advanced against dogged resistance to the foot of the Medjevica mountains. In so doing, they had killed, wounded, and captured hundreds of partisans, and completely changed the military situation in northeastern Bosnia. What was previously a communist stronghold was now the hunting ground of Germany's first ever Muslim SS division." End quote. A firm foothold had now been acquired in the Bosnians' designated area of operations, and the partisans had been given a very bloody nose. There was, however, still much to do. Operation Easter Egg was to be the next step. The Hanschau pushed further south with the intention of capturing the Tuzla salt mines and the Ugljevic coal mines. The partisans, once again, were swept aside. Some casualties were taken on the Axis side, but they were light by comparison. Sabrisvik issued guidelines to his troops regarding the Bosnians they now ruled over. Quote, "If available, local division members should be brought together before entering into towns. Spare villages, no destructive rages, engage only the enemy. Always remember that the parents, brothers, and sisters of our fellow division members live in the villages. Destroy no houses, chop down no fruit trees. Our doctors and dentists are to treat the civilian population whenever possible. No short-sightedness towards the civilian population. Those who carry on black marketeering and usurp the property of the people in the plundered homeland of the division will be sent to a concentration camp. Remember not, how many enemies have I killed? Rather, how many friends have I made?" End quote. Soon enough, however, the Bosnians were to be leaving their home territory. The next operation was further south, which no one was overly happy about. Regardless, they had a job to do south of the river Spreka. Their objective was firstly the town of Tuzla. From there, the towns of Vladanj in the west and Vlasanica in the east would be seized. Then, Zvornik could be seized, and a blockade could be formed against the Drina. This was to be Operation Maypole, one of the largest anti-partisan operations of the entire war. On the 23rd of April, the 28th Regiment advanced south and seized Tuzla on the first day before taking Stopari a day later. Elsewhere, Zvornik was seized and a line was set up between the town and Tuzla to stop the partisans heading north. The partisans were being hit on all sides by the Hanschau amongst others, but as always, large numbers of them were able to escape thanks to the terrain. Some, however, chose to counterattack, such as at Vlasanica, which had 2 entire communist divisions thrown at it. Sekavilci was also surrounded, and for the first time, the SS troopers were outnumbered and outgunned. The situation in Vlasanica quickly became critical, and casualties were mounting. Thankfully for the beleaguered defenders, however, they were relieved on the evening of the 28th, and the partisans suffered heavy losses. The next morning, the relief force headed for Sekavilci, in which a single company of Jaegers was somehow holding out. Just as they were on their last legs, the relievers arrived. The partisans, however, were in no mood to retreat. For once, they stood and fought. The Hanschau threw everything at the partisans. In the end, it paid off, and the day was won by the SS, and the partisans were sent reeling. The operation was closed on the 6th of May and declared a great success. The partisans had lost 956 men killed, and 96 had been captured. The partisans' 3rd Bosnia Corps had suffered a casualty rate of around 10% and failed in its mission of crossing the Drina to support their comrades in western Serbia. Tito's men were scattered, but by no means finished. Follow-up operations identified a concentration of several brigades worth of them in the Majevica Mountains. Determined to build upon the success of earlier actions, Sobovig resolved to launch a full divisional assault. On the 17th of May, the leading units headed into the hills for Operation Maybell. The partisans took a beating right away and were rapidly swept from the heights, taking severe casualties in the process. A relief attempt was beaten back by the Hanschau, and the divisional artillery pounded the partisans. By the 18th, it was all over, and the partisans that could slip away did so. The rest were dead or sent as prisoners to Ustasha concentration camps. With Maybell swiftly wrapped up, the Hanschau's first campaigning season had come to an end, and the unit returned to their home ground north of the Spreka River for garrison duty. Sabrisvik reported of the current situation, quote, "The territory between the Sava, Bosna, Spreka, and Drian rivers is now free of the Bolshevik terror. The enemy has been driven out with the heaviest losses. Scattered groups of defeated or expelled mobile enemy forces attempting to return shall be destroyed immediately. All local communist organizations have been eradicated through the elimination of all sponsors, organizers, and commissars, among these many Jews." End quote. A week after the Hanschau began its recovery, the Germans launched Operation Knight's Move in an attempt to assassinate Tito. The parachute operation was a fiasco. Only 200 of the 600 paratroopers were alive and unwounded when the relief force arrived, and all that was found of Tito was a marshal's uniform, which he had forgotten in his haste to escape. The last gamble to win the partisan war had failed. Soon enough, Germany's enemies launched Operation Overlord and Operation Bagration. The Balkans now became even more of a sideshow than before, and Tito's forces immediately took the offensive. The country went up in flames almost overnight, and northeastern Bosnia was no exception. Tito's 3rd Bosnia Corps organized itself into 3 columns and headed into the Hanschau's home turf. The Hanschau's reaction was known as Operation Full Moon. 2 Jaeger regiments with artillery support were to strike north and pin the attacking partisans to the Drina River. German intelligence, however, was faulty. There were far more partisans than the Germans had initially reckoned. Chaos reigned as the Handschar assault became confused and hopelessly muddled with the partisan spearheads. SS Hauptsturmführer Hein Driesner's battalion took up a position in the hills, covering Le Pas. Nothing but a quiet night was expected on the 8th of June. The partisans knew of Driesner's location, however, and they pounced with a full-on assault. Coordinated defense broke down almost immediately, and the battalion disintegrated. Those who could flee did so, and the rest were slaughtered. Communications between the subunits was non-existent, and so Driesner was unable to warn of what was to come. 7th Battery's 80 men were suddenly swamped by 1,000 partisans and slaughtered despite fighting bravely for 4 hours. Half of their number were left dead, and the survivors had to make a break for it. A major Handschar counterattack took place after the initial shock. This was not to be like before, however. Months before, the partisans would have reacted with a brief struggle before melting away into the forests and hills. Now, however, they would stand and fight. The Handschar's 4 Jaeger companies were forced to fight for every inch of territory, and casualties were heavy. Regardless, they pushed on and took village after village, and the officers led from the front in true Waffen-SS fashion. On the 10th of June, the partisans withdrew and left the streets of Le Pas and Zegenisse empty for the Handschar to take. Upon entry, the Handschar found dozens of their comrades, many of them viciously mutilated. The defeat had been a gigantic setback for the Handschar. Until now, northeastern Bosnia had been relatively quiet and was a rare Axis success story in occupied Yugoslavia. Now, however, the partisans had changed all of that. The Handschar had seen horrifying losses. A full quarter of its entire infantry strength had been obliterated in a few hours. One Handschar officer recalled that Le Pas had, quote, haunted the entire division. Regardless, the communists were pushed back over the Spreka River, and Salbersvig could report on the 12th of June that the partisans' 3rd Bosnia Corps had been defeated and lost 1,586 men killed in just 4 days. This was only half the story, of course. The Handschar had lost 205 men killed, 528 wounded, and a further 89 missing. This was over 5% of the division's entire strength. With the Allies making gains in Normandy, and the Soviets going from strength to strength in the east, the Handschar began to feel extremely uneasy. The tide had completely turned, and morale had been shattered. The good times, it seemed, were over. The division now retreated into a period of reorganization. Recruits were drafted in to make up the losses, and some of the Jaeger regiments were expanded. 500 Croatian Volksdeutsch were even brought in from the Reich Labor Service to stiffen up the unit. New equipment was hard to find, however, and things weren't quite the same. On top of this, Himmler decided to create a second Bosnian Muslim division, the Kamer. A substantial number of the Handschar's best men were stripped away and sent to the new unit, which eventually just went nowhere. Key senior personnel went with them, including Salbersvig, who was reassigned elsewhere. It was a blow which the division could simply never recover from. Worst of all, the unit wasn't even able to recover in a literal sense. The partisans continued to launch attacks into northeastern Bosnia and constantly harried the Handschar. Large bodies of partisans would cross the Spreka, Sava, and Drina rivers to harass them endlessly. As soon as one attack was put down, another would begin. There seemed to be no let-up. SS Standartenführer Desiderius Hampel was now in charge of the division, and he was not content with merely reacting to the partisans. In an attempt to put Tito's men on the back foot, he ordered the planning of Operation Flypaper to seize and destroy the partisan airstrip in the Osmaki area, which was being used for resupply by the Allies. Operating with the Chetniks, the Handschar launched an attack which lasted a single day. The airstrip was destroyed, the communists withdrew, whilst losing 42 men killed in the process, and the Handschar suffered only 4 deaths. Next, the unit was to head towards Sekavilci, which was acting as a supply base for the partisans across eastern Bosnia. Operation Wild Rose began on the 17th of July, and immediately ran into fierce resistance in the mountainous terrain. The main partisan division did have to give way though. The sheer weight of the SS offensive was too much to bear. By the 23rd of July, they were fleeing the area, and despite fighting bravely, they had suffered horrible losses. 947 partisans lost their lives, and the rest had to run for it. The Handschar then began a systematic search of the partisan tunnels, which were supposed to be their bases. Initially, they found nothing, and it seemed as if the entire operation had been one big distraction. Persistence paid off in the end though, and a series of tunnels was found, which included a map of secret locations. The teams then found out and discovered all there was to find. The bounty was gigantic. After several days, an anti-tank gun, 2 mortars, 22 machine guns, 800 rifles, and 500,000 rounds of ammunition had been found. The partisans had spent 2 entire years building up this network of hidden bases, only for the Handschar to destroy all of them within days. There was no time to rest. Tito was moving large forces from Bosnia down towards the Serbian border in order to support an offensive from Montenegro in the south. The Germans responded quickly and attempted to encircle and destroy the Bosnian partisans being used in the offensive. Operation Mincemeat kicked off on the 4th of August, and the result was the same as always. The communists took heavy casualties, then vanished into the terrain, only to reappear once the Germans were gone. 227 partisans were slain, and a further 50 were captured and sent off to camps. All of these offensives were dealing damage, but the knockout blow continued to elude the Germans, and at the end of the day, this was what mattered against partisans. The communists seemed to have an endless supply of manpower, and they were being absolutely flooded with equipment by the Allies from Italy. Tito's men were continuously growing stronger despite all the setbacks, whilst the Axis forces grew ever weaker. The Handschar were killing the partisans at a rate of 10 to 1, yet it meant nothing without the killer blow, which never came. In the north, the Poles were in revolt during the Warsaw Uprising, and Stalin's armies had stopped at the Vistula. A momentous decision had been made. The Red Army would focus on Germany's client states and then the Balkans instead. On the 4th of September, Tito ordered another general offensive, and once more, the Handschar found themselves under attack from their nemesis, the 3rd Bosnia Corps. Village after village came under attack, but as usual, fierce SS counterattacks were sent in. This was not to be a rerun of the same old successful operations, however. The Allies had flown in massed air attacks against key transport and supply routes in the Balkans in order to hinder the German withdrawal from Greece. Desertion had become endemic, and by the second week of September, the Handschar was withdrawing northwards towards Bricko on the Sava River. Since the 1st of September, the division had lost over 2,000 men to desertion, and disintegration was becoming a serious possibility. An amnesty was offered by Tito, and several hundred more deserters went right over to the 3rd Bosnia Corps and fought alongside their old enemies. The southern half of the secure zone had been handed over to the 12th Ustasha Brigade, and on the 17th of September, the entire formation deserted to the partisans. The Germans were left with two choices. They could either import 2,000 Germans into the ranks to shore up the division, or it could be disbanded altogether, and the Bosnians could be handed over to the Ustasha. The division's weapons and German personnel could be used as replacements for Waffen SS formations in Hungary. When this idea was brought before Himmler, however, he exploded. The only problem in his eyes was strong leadership, and he demanded that the Handschar not be dissolved. They were instead to be renewed with National Socialist vigor, as he put it. Meanwhile, in reality, Romania had switched sides in August, and by early October, the Red Army was getting closer and closer to Bosnia as it entered northern Serbia and began to fight its way southwards. Tito was a communist, but no Stalinist, and he wanted to liberate as much of his own country as possible before the Red Army got there. With this goal in mind, he continued to throw his men at the Handschar, who desperately tried to hang on. There was some success amongst the misery. On the 9th of October, Hans Koenig carried out a masterly ambush on the 17th Majevica Brigade at Vukasavci. With mortars and heavy machine guns, he surprised the well-armed brigade before finishing them off at bayonet point. 67 communists were killed, and the survivors were scattered, leaving their equipment behind. An entire brigade had been crushed. The overall picture, however, still looked gloomy. By mid-October, the situation was so perilous that the Germans had no choice but to transfer the Handschar north into Croatia proper in order to help them hold the line. They were to leave their families, who they had been protecting, behind them. The decision was taken knowing full well that it would probably trigger mass desertions. Within a couple of days, Regiment 27 alone lost 642 men who simply took their weapons and headed home to face the inevitable retribution from the communists. This way, at least, they could perhaps defend their families. SS Oberstarführer Bruno Berger, who had been posted to the division due to his knowledge of Islam, said of the situation, quote, "They deserted with all of their equipment. The reason that they gave for their desertion was that they were needed to defend their homeland, and taking them away went against all the promises they had been given." End quote. The division was now so weakened that it was referred to as Waffenverband Handschar. Entire subunits had simply packed up and walked, or in some cases, driven back to Bosnia. The supposedly elite Divisional Staff Security Company of 101 men mutinied en masse at the urging of their imam and took everything, including its anti-aircraft guns, with it. There was now only around 10,000 Bosnians left in the division, and Himmler at last decided to see reality. He ordered a reorganization of the division. They were to be disarmed and their weapons given to German units, except for a small minority who were considered to be unswervingly loyal. The other Bosnians were to be formed into labor battalions or sent as Hiwis to other formations. On the 25th of October, this delicate operation went off without a hitch. The Handschar had overnight gone from a majority Muslim division to one in which Muslims made up only half of its strength. On the 9th of November, the remnants of the Handschar were ordered into Hungary and onto the offensive at the front of Patina. The Bosnians' task was to wipe out a Soviet bridgehead. Thanks to Luftwaffe's support, they were actually successful, and the Russians would push back, almost to Apatin and Batina on the 12th of November. By the 20th, however, the Red Army had put down pontoon bridges and were flooding over the Danube. There were simply too many of them, and soon enough, the men were fighting for their lives. Hans Koenig's predicament was typical of the situation. His citation for the German cross in gold reads, quote, "After Koenig's battalion withstood 5 days of the most difficult offensive fighting against a vastly superior foe and sustained bloody losses, the enemy broke through positions situated to the west of the battalion sector after the last company commander was killed. In spite of the hopelessness of the situation, Koenig personally led 11 of his men in a counterattack and threw the enemy back. The foe answered with the fire of their heavy weapons on the breaking point, killing 10 of the men and seriously wounding another. Koenig, himself wounded, held the position single-handedly with hand grenades and ammunition brought forward by his messenger. He held the enemy long enough for his shattered battalion to consolidate and reorganize in a new position, 100 meters behind the breakthrough point." End quote. Bravery was not enough. On the 21st, the Germans were swept aside by the sheer mass of Soviet troops. By this point, only a few Muslims were left in the ranks, and the remnants were sent off to the Margaret position defensive line, stretching from Lake Balaton in Hungary to the Croatian border, where the unit was involved in bitter fighting into the new year and well into February 1945. The now barely recognizable unit then took part in Germany's final offensive, Operation Spring Awakening in Hungary. The Handschar, however, only played a very minor part. On the 24th of March 1945, the Handschar had only 9,062 troops on duty, only 3,770 of whom were combat ready. 5 days later, the Soviets launched their own offensive, and the Handschar was sent into a long retreat, along with the other German units in the area. Casualties mounted, and by the 6th of April, the Red Army was over the Austrian border. The unit's last shots of the war were fired at Kiesmendorf on the 19th of April as they repulsed a Soviet attack. The remaining Muslims, led by the imams, asked to be freed from their oaths, allowed to return home. The request was accepted, and Himmler's last Bosnians headed off on their almost certainly doomed march home. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please do leave a like. It helps immensely. An especially big thank you to those of you who have subscribed to me on Subscribestar or signed up as a YouTube member. Without your kind support, I wouldn't be able to make these videos for a living, and I cannot possibly thank you enough. Even the lowest tier helps immensely. Thank you.